Today, I'm riding Canada's newest train, boarding here in Canada's oldest city and one of the oldest passenger trains still in service in the country. This is the longest business train you'll find anywhere in Canada. In this video, I'll cover the stories along this route, the food and service on board, and the nightmare that this trip turned into during the final stretch into Toronto, and everything in between. So let's begin. Today, we start things off here in Quebec City, where I took my mom to what is widely regarded as the most photographed hotel in the entire world, the Chateau Frontenac, for 2 nights. And if you want to learn more about the 140-year-old hotel, well, I just released a full video on it last week, so you can check that out after you finish this one. But this morning, we would check out of the Chateau and head down the Dufferin Terrace and begin a 1-kilometer trek through the streets of Quebec towards one of the oldest active passenger stations in all of Canada to board one of its newest trains. The station itself opened in 1915, built by the Canadian Pacific Railway to welcome passengers arriving from Europe by steamship along the St. Lawrence River, outside the beautiful Chateau Frontenac as you see here, and the passengers would then board a train heading west for the untouched beauty of the Canadian Rockies, or vice versa in the opposite direction. Now the station is named Gare du Palais, which in English means Palace Station, which makes a lot of sense, since it does look almost like a mini palace, or a mini Chateau Frontenac if you compare them side by side. But the station is also almost an identical clone of the original Canadian Pacific waterfront station that they opened in Vancouver in 1898 and was then demolished less than 20 years later. Gare du Palais would become a Union station a few years after opening following World War I and would begin serving both Canadian National and Canadian Pacific passenger trains, a time when you could still see the Chateau Frontenac towering above the skyline from the station tracks below. But by 1976, the station would close and was slated for demolition to follow shortly after. She would lay empty until 1985, when the new government-formed Crown Corporation Via Rail Canada would reopen it. Now, the station originally featured 6 tracks heading south, as you see here in the old school photo, but during the closure, the Canadian Pacific would remove all passenger tracks outside the station, so Via would have to construct 3 new tracks facing north instead, which would then be enclosed so that the buildings that exist on top of it today could be constructed shortly after. But the station itself would reopen on November 8th of 1985, and the great station would begin serving passengers once again. Today, Gare du Palais stands as one of Via Rail's 4 heritage stations, alongside Halifax Station, Winnipeg Union Station, and Pacific Central in Vancouver. Via pledged $125 million back in 2023 to try and bring all these stations up to a modern-day standard, so as much of a bummer as it is to arrive and see the great station here in Quebec undergoing a major facelift, and the majority of her interior, including the stone arches and vaulted ceilings, almost completely unrecognizable, it is good to know that she will continue serving passengers the same way that she has for over 110 years, and when she's done, she will shine again looking something like this, as you see from my friend, Davion West. So Mom and I would head inside the station, and we would head for the check-in desk and into the business lounge for a very much needed espresso this morning. Now, apparently arriving an hour before your train departs is relatively excessive, but I don't see that as a negative. I actually see that as a pretty big positive, because it just means that Mom and I get to relax and enjoy the entire place to ourselves. No crowds, no noise, just great quality mother-son bonding time, a few cold drinks from the fridge inside the lounge, and not to mention this cool poster advertising for Jasper, Alberta, which, to be honest, is one of the most beautiful places you'll see in all of Canada, and a destination that you'll see featured in the next episode in this series, Heading West by Train. And shortly after, we'd head down to the platform. Our train today is one of the newest in all of Canada, the Siemens Venture, a sleek, fully electric fleet introduced just last year, but let's be honest, it pales in comparison to the classic stainless steel look of the Canadian, which we'll actually be riding tomorrow from Toronto to Vancouver, but that is if we even get to Toronto later tonight, but I'll cover that more in a bit. And soon after, with boarding complete, we would begin easing out of the station, crossing over the St. Charles River, rolling past the Port of Quebec and the CN freight yards just on the other side of the water. And it wasn't long after that we would roll by Videotron Center, which is the home for hopefully a future NHL team that will return to Quebec City someday. And that right there in the distance, that right there is the Chateau Frontenac. Now sadly, Quebec's castle will be the last visible major landmark that we'll see before the skyline becomes no longer visible, but The rest of this trip would see us hugging the mighty St. Lawrence River pretty much all the way into Montreal for later this afternoon. And soon we'll be crossing one of the most historic structures along this route, the Quebec City Bridge. Construction on the bridge began in the year 1900, but 7 years later in 1907, nearing completion, the bridge would collapse. Now they would pick up the pieces and try again, and in 1916, this time lifting the central span of the bridge into place, before again the bridge would collapse. Now, the third time was in fact the charm here, and after nearly 2 decades of work, 2 catastrophic failures, and 88 lives lost, on December 3rd of 1917, the bridge would open, and over a century later, it still carries trains across the St. Lawrence, just like us today. Now back inside, Mom and I were actually in a pretty good mood, and looking forward to the day ahead together. And today we were riding in business class, and the experience in here is pretty unique. The service offered on board is on full display pretty much immediately after we left Quebec City. Our car attendant would come and offer us some sparkling water and a nice hot cup of joe, and full props to Via also. I absolutely love the fact that they serve it in real glasses and real coffee mugs. It's little stuff like this that goes a long way. And about 30 minutes after that, meal service would begin, and, well, here's the thing. I'll be blunt, to say the hot food on Via's business trains lately is serviceable at best, I think would be very generous. I mean, it hasn't always been this way. I remember a couple years ago taking the train, the roast chicken or the beef pot roast dinners that they offered on board were absolutely fantastic. And listen, I can be a little bit of a food critic sometimes, but even my mom described it as, to be honest, barely edible. But outside of the food, the service is great. I mean, they kept the sparkling water coming, and I don't think that my coffee ever got below halfway full or even close to lukewarm. So 2 thumbs up as far as that's concerned. So this trip goes Quebec City to Toronto, but Via Rail actually doesn't offer any direct routes, so we'll be changing trains here in Montreal. And about 3 hours after leaving Quebec City, the silhouette of the Montreal skyline would begin to rise off in the distance. We'll cross over the Victoria Bridge, a bridge that actually opened over 150 years ago in 1860, meaning that she has stood for longer than Canada has even been a country. And although today it's been retrofitted to accommodate passenger trains alongside some street traffic, as you see here, as we continue to chug over the St. Lawrence River towards the Port of Montreal. This will complete the first portion of the trip and into Montreal Central Station, roughly 45 minutes behind schedule. But if we were on time, we would be arriving just 30 minutes shy of making a direct connection to the next train going to Toronto with no stopover compared to here, where Mom and I will have just shy of 3 hours to kill before we reboard. But my mom has also never been to Montreal before, so this just means I get 3 hours to show her the beautiful streets of the city, Windsor Station, which is the former Canadian Pacific Station, or the Chateau Champlain, which was the final Grand Railway hotel built in all of Canada, completed in 1966, where Belle and I actually stayed earlier this year. There's a dedicated video to that if you want to check that one out after. Back on the station, we would recharge with one last espresso in the business lounge and head down to the platform and board our train out of Montreal Central, heading west around the Port of Montreal with a final goodbye to the Montreal skyline with a 5.5 hour journey ahead into Toronto. Now tonight, before everything derailed, we actually got a really beautiful sunset to cap off the trip. And we were scheduled to arrive in Toronto just after 8:30 p.m. But there's one massive problem. Via Rail owns only 3% of all the tracks that it operates on. The other 97% is controlled by freight and commuter operators, which means when Go Transit in Toronto decides that they want to shut things down to do some major track repairs west of Toronto on the same track that we're going on, that means we're getting a big detour. And although we're only an hour away from Toronto Union Station in real time, our actual arrival time will get pushed back to just before 1 a.m., which is almost 4 hours late on a 5-hour train ride. But it is a good thing that I brought my Manta Sleep Mask Pro, which is also today's video sponsor. And whether you're flying or taking the train, Manta Sleep has the best sleep mask and neck pillow money can buy, so get one today. And the Manta Pro sleep mask that I'm using here has true 100% blackout, unmatched breathability, zero pressure on your eyes, and it is engineered for anybody that likes to sleep on their side. And it's also got an anti-slip strip. And if you're still on the fence for some reason, I'm going to make it even easier for you by getting you 10% off your Manta Sleep Mask today when you click the first link in the video description and use my code TRAV, that is my name, TRAV, for 10% off the best night's sleep money can buy. And thank you so much to Manta Sleep for making this video possible. Get a sleep mask today. Now, I appreciate that VIA was willing to offer a 50% future travel credit that you have to use within 12 months for the inconvenience, but let's zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture. During this cross-Canada trip alone, Bella and I would arrive 8 hours late into Winnipeg, 7 hours late into Toronto, 1 hour late into Montreal, and 2 hours late on a 2.5-hour trip from Montreal to Ottawa. All 5 were completely separate trips, and although the Quebec to Montreal portion in today's video was only 45 minutes late, which I guess is on time for Via Rail standards, their current on-time performance rating is just 59%. Now, as mentioned, we would arrive just before 1 a.m. as the Via Rail schedule predicted. Mom and I would head across the street into the Royal York for our stay for the night, although a little bit of a quick shift. It'll only be a 6-hour sleep, where tomorrow morning we are reboarding and heading on the Canada's most famous train, the second longest train journey in the world, going from here in downtown Toronto to Winnipeg, through the Rockies, and arriving on the Pacific Coast in Vancouver 4 days later. This episode is part of a series where I'm traveling across Canada by train, sharing the stories and the experiences of over a century ago, and I want you there with me. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button for next week's video. Over 100 hours, 4,000 kilometers, and 5 days across Canada with the greatest mom in the world, my mom. Yes, I know I'm biased. From here in Toronto to the West Coast in Vancouver, back where this series started, well over 2 months ago. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.